My name is Clara Bennett. I am 32 years old, and for years I have sat through Christmas dinners where my mother praised my sister, where neighbors smiled at her accomplishments, and where I learned to stay quiet. I thought I was used to it until this Christmas, when my mother looked straight at me across the table and said words that shattered whatever place I still had in this family. In that moment, I realized silence was no longer an option. I had brought something with me that night, something they never expected, and when it was finally revealed, every smile in that room disappeared. What would you do if your own mother erased you on Christmas night? Stay with me, because this story will show you how one gift changed everything. Let me take you back to where it began. The December air in Evanston had that sharp bite that always made my breath feel heavy. And as I walked up the stone steps to my parents' house, I could see the glow of Christmas lights dancing against the snow. The Bennett family Christmas dinner was a tradition one I had never missed, not even in years when I wanted to. That night, the house looked perfect from the outside, like something from a holiday magazine spread, but I knew better. Behind the warm lights and carols, there was always a storm waiting, and this year I could feel it more than ever. Inside, the scent of roasted turkey spice cider and cinnamon cookies wrapped around me, pulling me back to every Christmas I had lived here. The dining room tables stretched long and heavy with china my mother only took out once a year. Garland wrapped around the stair railings, a massive tree glittered in the living room, and the fire in the stone hearth gave everything a golden glow. On the surface, it was flawless. Beneath it, I felt like a guest in my own family. My mother, Margaret, was at the center of everything as usual. She wore a red satin dress that caught the light every time she moved, her silver necklace flashing like she was on stage. She greeted the neighbors and friends who had been invited to fill the table. My father, Edward, stayed near her shoulder, nodding politely, carrying wine bottles like an obedient stagehand. Then there was Rachel, my sister, the star of the evening. At 30, she already had the confidence of a woman who had always been told she was the pride of the family. She walked in with Bradley at her side, his tailored suit sharp, his arm linked with hers like a prize. Everyone at the table turned when she entered, applause almost breaking out, voices rising to welcome her. I stayed in my chair, smiling just enough to avoid questions. I knew my role. I always did. The overlooked daughter, the one whose accomplishments were small talk at best. My job as a marketing manager in Chicago never made headlines here. My parents never bragged about my steady income, my independence, my apartment that I had bought on my own. To them it was all ordinary, not worth comparing to Rachel's life. I tried to settle into the chair at the far end of the table. The silverware gleamed, the candles flickered, and conversations rose all around me. I caught a glimpse of Jessica, my childhood friend, laughing with Rachel. She was supposed to be my friend, but somewhere along the way she had slipped closer to Rachel's orbit, sharing inside jokes, whispering with her at the table. She waved when our eyes met, but the warmth felt thin. I filled my glass with water instead of wine. I wanted my mind clear. Something about the way my mother kept glancing down the table at me told me that tonight was not just about Christmas cheer. She had a plan, and the thought of it made my stomach knot. Dinner began with the usual rituals. My father carved the turkey. Rachel leaned into Bradley as if the whole room revolved around them, and my mother told stories of Rachel's cases at the firm, how her colleagues admired her, how Bradley's firm had made impressive gains this year. Every compliment was wrapped around Rachel like garland around the tree. When talk drifted near me, my mother smiled politely and moved the conversation along. I forced bites of turkey past the tightness in my throat. The laughter around me felt distant, almost rehearsed. I kept wondering why they had invited so many people this year. Usually it was just family, maybe a close neighbor or two. Tonight the table was packed, a small audience. My mother liked to perform, but why tonight, why now? Halfway through dinner, I noticed her fingers tapping the stem of her wine glass, a little rhythm she always had when she was about to stand up and make an announcement. My pulse quickened. My father shifted in his seat, his face too still, like he was preparing for a cue. Rachel leaned closer to Bradley, her smile smug as if she already knew what was coming. I stared at the tree across the room. Its lights twinkled red and gold, the angel on top glowing softly. For a moment I thought of my childhood of unwrapping modest gifts while Rachel showed off diamond earrings or designer bags. The sting of those moments came back sharp, mixing with the heat in my chest. I told myself to stay calm, to watch, to remember every detail. My mother stood then, lifting her glass so the chandelier light caught it. Conversations hushed, heads turned. The room held its breath, waiting. She looked down the table, her gaze sweeping over everyone but landing squarely on me. Her smile was poised cold beneath the sparkle of her lipstick. I tightened my grip on my fork, my heart hammering in my ears, already bracing for the words I knew were about to fall. My mother's lips parted, and before the first word even left her mouth, I was back in another Christmas long ago. I was 12, sitting in this same dining room staring at a smaller tree, but feeling just as invisible. Rachel had been given a pearl necklace, dainty and elegant from our parents. I had opened a box to find a wool sweater, 2 sizes too big, the tag still attached, clearly picked up at the last minute. Everyone laughed, calling it practical, something I could grow into. Rachel had twirled her pearls in the mirror, soaking up their applause while I pretended not to care. The memory burned as fresh as the wine in my glass. That was how it always was. Rachel, adorned with everything glittering and worthy of admiration, me handed what was left over. At 16, when I made honor roll and waited for my parents to show up at the assembly, they never came. They were across town at Rachel's dance competition, cheering until they lost their voices. I remember standing on that stage, holding my certificate, scanning the crowd for a familiar face, and realizing there wasn't one. Jessica had been in the audience that day, clapping for me, her face red from the cold, and I had held on to that comfort. Even then, my loyalty to her had outweighed my resentment. By the time I was 18, the pattern was cemented. At my high school graduation, they were late, sliding into the back row, only after Rachel's boyfriend's family had arrived. Later they apologized, saying traffic was terrible, but I knew better. They had been at a brunch thrown in Rachel's honor. She hadn't even graduated yet, but she was already the reason to celebrate. That night, with the chandelier sparkling above us, I thought of my grandfather, William Harper. He had been the only one to truly see me. When I was 10, he slipped me $5 at Christmas and whispered that I should buy something just for myself, not for anyone else. He had looked me in the eye and told me, someday you will need to stand strong when no one else is standing with you. His words had stayed tucked in a corner of my heart, though I never fully understood them until I was older. Another memory surfaced, one of the sharpest. I was 21, back home from college for the holidays. Rachel had just landed an internship with a big law firm in downtown Chicago, and the family threw a party for her. My mother gave a toast, lifting her champagne glass high, and called Rachel the future of the Bennett legacy. I stood there with my marketing textbook still marked with highlighter, unmentioned, unnoticed. I told myself it didn't matter, that what mattered was the degree I was working toward, the independence I was carving out for myself. But deep inside, I had wanted just once to hear my parents say they were proud of me. I glanced down the table at Rachel now, her diamond earrings sparkling under the chandelier, Bradley's hand resting on hers. She looked so much like the girl from every memory, basking in the glow that was handed to her without question. I realized how much I had internalized those years, how I had trained myself to expect nothing, to swallow the hurt before it showed on my face. The scrape of a fork against porcelain pulled me back to the present. The dining room was quiet, everyone waiting for my mother's words. My heart pounded, but instead of fear, I felt a strange calm. It was the same calm I had learned as a child, when the gifts under the tree were uneven, when the seats at my school events stayed empty. It was the calm of someone who knew what was coming. I lifted my water glass, taking a slow sip, and let my eyes wander to the tree again. Its ornaments glittered, each one chosen with care. I remembered how Rachel used to hang the expensive ones near the top, while I was told to handle the plastic baubles near the bottom. I remembered how I had reached for the fragile angel ornament one year, and my mother had quickly taken it from my hands, saying it was too delicate for me. I had been 14, and that small gesture had stung more than I could admit. Sitting there now, watching Rachel glow in her perfect seat at the table, I knew this night was another ornament I was not meant to touch. Another ritual of exclusion wrapped in holiday shine. But what they did not know was that I was no longer that 14-year-old girl. I was 32, and I had carried all their dismissals like stones, building something heavy but unbreakable inside me. Rachel leaned closer to Bradley, whispering something that made him chuckle, her eyes flicking toward me with the same smugness she had worn since childhood. It was the same look she gave me the night she opened her first car keys. While I unwrapped a set of luggage my parents insisted would be useful for college. I breathed in, deeply letting the scent of cinnamon and roasted turkey ground me. The voices around me blurred into a dull hum. My mother's hand tightened on her glass. My father's jaw clenched. Bradley looked expectant, Rachel radiant. All the Christmases of being overlooked, all the graduations, all the birthdays, all the moments of silence and absence settled over me like a second skin. My fork rested on the plate, my palms steady on the tablecloth. My mother's voice rose above the room, crisp and deliberate, carrying the weight of whatever storm she was about to unleash. She began with a toast to Rachel and Bradley, her words polished and dripping with pride, and the table filled with applause. I clapped too, though my hands barely made a sound, my chest tight, with the familiar ache of being invisible. It was nothing new. I had lived through decades of these moments where Rachel's smallest achievement became a crown jewel and mine were brushed aside like clutter on the mantel. I lowered my gaze to my plate and reminded myself that I had my own life, one they could never diminish, no matter how they tried. My job as a marketing manager in Chicago might not impress my parents, but I knew the hours I poured into my work mattered. I had built a reputation for delivering results for managing clients who trusted me to craft campaigns that actually worked. It was not glamorous, but it was steady. It was mine, and it was enough to pay for the apartment I had bought in Lincoln Park without a cent of family help. Most of my coworkers at Parker & Rowe, the mid-sized firm where I worked, probably did not know what my family thought of me. They saw me as capable, reliable, the one who could fix a campaign gone sideways. But at this table, I was still just Clara, the lesser Bennett daughter. I caught myself glancing toward Rachel again. Her laugh carried easily, her diamond bracelet glittering under the chandelier as she leaned into Bradley's shoulder. He nodded along, as if every word she spoke was worth framing. I wondered if he knew how my parents truly operated, if he had seen the favoritism and swallowed it as normal. My thoughts drifted to Nathan Clark, the founder of the startup I had invested in last year. He had pitched me an idea over coffee one spring afternoon, a renewable energy software that could predict grid failures before they happened. He was brilliant, the kind of person who lived and breathed his work, and he had reminded me that my perspective had value. I was the first outside investor to believe in him, not because I had piles of money to spare, but because I trusted his vision. Every update he sent me about the progress of the company felt like a reminder that I was more than the forgotten daughter at this table. Nathan had once told me, "Clara, you see things no one else notices." That sentence had carried me through more than one long night when I wondered if I mattered at all. As the clinking of glasses subsided, my father leaned toward my mother and whispered something I could not catch. His hand rested briefly on her arm before falling back to the table. His silence had always been the shadow of her sharpness. Where she was loud and decisive, he was quiet, but never in my defense. I forced a smile at the neighbor across from me, a kind woman named Diane, who had lived down the street since I was a child. She asked politely about my work, and I began to answer, explaining a recent campaign I had led for a small retail brand in Chicago. But before I could finish, my mother's voice cut through the air, pivoting the conversation back to Rachel's latest courtroom success. The table lit up with admiration again, and my words dissolved into nothing. Diane gave me a sympathetic glance, her mouth closing softly as she lifted her fork. The familiar sting pressed at the corners of my eyes, but I would not let myself cry here. Instead, I thought of the evenings in my apartment when I cooked dinner for myself, a glass of red wine in hand music playing while I chopped vegetables. I thought of the freedom of knowing every piece of furniture in that apartment had been chosen by me, paid for by me, a life no one could strip away. Bradley raised his glass again and spoke about the bright future he and Rachel were planning, about the law firm connections, the social circles, the vacations ahead. The table hung on his every word. I noticed Jessica sitting closer to Rachel than to me, her hand resting on Rachel's arm, laughing along with every story. Once years ago, Jessica would have been beside me, whispering sarcastic jokes to help me survive nights like this. Now she was part of the glow around my sister. I reached for my napkin, dabbing at the corner of my mouth, though it was dry. The noise of the room faded for a moment as I reminded myself that I had already carved out something different. My job was not prestigious, but it was real. Nathan's startup was not yet a household name, but it was growing, and I was part of it from the start. My parents had no idea, and they would not have cared even if they did. But the thought settled me. They could toast Rachel until their voices cracked, and I would still have my work, my independence, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I was building something they could not touch. The night dragged on with desserts and more toasts. I ate my slice of pecan pie, slowly letting the sweetness distract me from the sourness in my chest. The voices around me rose and fell, Rachel's name repeated like a hymn. I stayed still, my fork poised, listening, waiting. When the clock struck 8 and the plates were cleared, I felt my pulse begin to quicken again. My mother placed her hands on the back of her chair, steady and deliberate. The way the room hushed told me she was about to shift from pleasantries to the real reason this dinner had been arranged. I folded my napkin across my lap and kept my face composed, but inside I braced myself. Whatever storm was coming, I would meet it without flinching. My phone had buzzed earlier that afternoon with a name that carried more weight than any toast in that dining room. David Ross, my grandfather's old attorney, had called while I was getting ready. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me knew better. I had stepped into my bedroom, shut the door, and answered with a quiet, "Hello." David's voice was calm, but deliberate. "Clara, I thought you should know what has been happening with your grandfather's estate." My stomach dropped and I sank onto the edge of the bed. He explained that after William Harper passed in 2018, he had left behind a will that was straightforward. $2.3 million in assets divided equally between his two granddaughters. Half for Rachel, half for me. My throat tightened hearing it, not because of the money, but because it sounded like him. He had always been the one to notice me, the one to whisper that I was stronger than I believed. It felt like he had left me something more than cash. It was recognition, proof that I mattered. David continued his words, careful. "Your mother has been contacting my office, pushing to amend certain parts of the distribution. Legally, it is not possible without your consent, but she is persistent. She is trying to redirect your portion to Rachel entirely." I pressed a hand to my forehead, the weight of his words pressing down. My mother had found a way to turn even my grandfather's love into another contest, another prize for Rachel. I asked what she needed from me. "For now, nothing," David said. "Just be aware. Do not sign anything they give you without reading it first." His tone sharpened slightly. "And Clara, remember, this is yours by right. Your grandfather wanted it that way." I hung up, staring at the reflection in the mirror across from me. My hair curled neatly at my shoulders, my dress smoothed my makeup set, but underneath I felt raw. I thought of the afternoons I had spent with my grandfather on his porch, listening to him talk about his years as a factory foreman, about saving every dollar. He had not lived a flashy life, but he had been steady, principled, generous. And now his last gift to me was being stolen before it even reached my hands. The voices in the dining room grew louder, laughter filling the air, snapping me back into the present. I tucked the napkin across my lap and sat straighter, remembering David's warning. If they brought papers tonight, if they tried to corner me in front of this crowd, I would not fold. My mother's eyes flicked toward me as she cleared her throat, her smile stretched tight. "There is family business we must address." She began, her tone smooth but edged with authority. Around the table, forks paused in midair, glasses lowered. Bradley looked curious. Rachel's smug Jessica wide-eyed but silent. I forced myself to hold my mother's gaze, though my pulse hammered in my neck. She had a folder on the buffet behind her chair, thick with documents. My father shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming against the tablecloth. He would never say the words himself, but he was part of this. He always had been. Rachel leaned forward, her voice dripping with false sympathy. It is really just a formality, Clara. You know how complicated estates can be. I almost laughed at the audacity. She had no idea that I already knew the truth, that I had heard it from the lawyer who actually mattered. My fork scraped softly against the plate as I pushed away what little food was left. The air felt charged heavy with expectation. I could feel every eye on me waiting for me to crumble, to agree to play my part as the obedient daughter who always accepted less. I thought again of my grandfather's hand on mine, the steady way he had said I was stronger than I knew. His voice steadied me now, reminding me that the woman sitting at this table was not the girl who had swallowed tears at Christmas past. I folded my hands neatly on the napkin and gave my mother a small, steady smile. If she thought she was about to corner me into surrender, she was mistaken. She reached for the folder. The room hushed, all conversations slipping away, and the storm that had been building all evening began to break. My mother slid the folder onto the table with a practiced elegance, her manicured nails tapping once on the cover as if to command attention. Rachel's chin lifted, her smile sharp with anticipation, and Bradley leaned back in his chair as though watching a performance staged just for him. Jessica, sitting just a seat away from Rachel, shifted uncomfortably but kept her eyes fixed on me. The folder sat there like a loaded gun. My mother finally opened it, pulling out a stack of papers, her tone calm but dripping with authority. These are documents we need to finalize regarding the family trust. It is a technical matter, nothing to worry about. She slid the first page toward me. I looked down without touching it. The words blurred at first, but then sharpened as I forced my focus. Consent to amend distribution of Harper Trust. My grandfather's name, my name, Rachel's name. Lines and clauses I had no doubt were carefully written to erase me. Rachel broke the silence. Honestly, Clara, it makes sense. You live on your own. You have no husband, no children. You do fine with your job in Chicago. I mean, you have enough right. The trust was meant to strengthen the family's legacy, and let's be real, I am the one continuing that. The room buzzed with soft laughter, polite nods, as though what she said was reasonable. My cheeks burned, but I kept my face steady. I did not move, did not reach for the pen my father had placed beside the papers. My mother leaned in, her perfume sharp with roses. It is just paperwork, Clara. Nothing more. We know your grandfather would have wanted what is best for the family. A memory struck me then of Jessica and me at 16, sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor, whispering about our futures. She had promised she would always have my back, that she would never let Rachel or my mother tear me down. Back then, I had believed her without question. Now, as I glanced at her, I saw her eyes dart to Rachel before she lowered her gaze. I realized she knew. She had known about these papers before tonight. The sting of betrayal was sharper than the sting of Rachel's words. Jessica had been close to me for over 20 years, yet she sat there silent while my family prepared to strip away the last piece of my grandfather's love. My father finally spoke, his voice low but firm. Just sign it, Clara. Let's not make this into a spectacle. I pressed my palms flat on the tablecloth, willing my breath to steady. I remembered David Ross's warning echoing in my ear. Do not sign anything. Not without your consent. Not without reading. I thought of Nathan too, how he had told me I saw things others overlooked. He was right. I could see through every word, every performance happening around me. Jessica's hand twitched near her wineglass. For a second I thought she might speak. Instead, she forced a small smile at Rachel, nodding at something whispered to her. The final confirmation I needed. It was not just my family working against me. My best friend had already chosen her side. I slid the paper back across the table toward my mother, careful not to let my hand shake. I am not signing this. A murmur rippled through the room, the neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their seats. My mother's expression froze, the smile gone. Rachel let out a sharp laugh, tossing her hair back. Of course you want to make this about you, Clara. You always do. I turned my eyes on Jessica. She flinched, her lips parting as if to explain, but no words came out. Her silence was answer enough. I pushed my chair back slowly, the scrape of the legs against the hardwood loud in the tense quiet. My voice came out steady, even colder than I felt inside. If Grandpa wanted this trust divided equally, then that is how it stays. No amount of paper will change what he put in writing. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. My mother carefully stacked the papers back into the folder, her face unreadable, but I saw the flicker of anger in her eyes. Rachel muttered something to Bradley, who chuckled and shook his head. Jessica stared down at her lap, her wine untouched. I sat back down, folding my napkin again, my hands calm now. Inside, though, the betrayal sat heavy. I had walked into that dining room knowing my parents and Rachel would find a way to cut me out. What I had not expected was to find Jessica already standing on their side of the line. The voices around the table resumed slowly, forced small talk covering the silence like a thin blanket. But I knew the storm was not over. It was only beginning. Margaret excused herself from the table and drifted toward the living room where the towering Christmas tree glittered against the window. Guests followed her lead, gathering their wine glasses and dessert plates, filling the space with laughter that sounded practiced. I stayed seated for a moment, grounding myself with a sip of water before I finally stood and moved toward the crowd. She had switched roles seamlessly, slipping back into her public persona, the benevolent matriarch of the Bennett family. She was already recounting her latest project with the Evanston Women's League, describing how she spearheaded a holiday charity drive that raised over $200,000 for local shelters. Heads nodded and voices of admiration circled her like ornaments around the tree. Linda Green, president of the league, stood at her side. I caught the briefest flicker in her eyes as she listened. Linda was not easily impressed, and I knew she had her suspicions. She leaned toward me as I approached, her voice low enough for only me to hear. There are whispers, Clara. Numbers that do not match the reports. My breath caught. Whispers. That word felt heavier than the folder my mother had slid across the table earlier. Linda straightened and smiled brightly at Margaret, then excused herself to refresh her drink. Margaret barely noticed. She was too busy telling Bradley's parents about the recognition she expected from the mayor next month. I stepped aside, pretending to admire the ornaments on the tree, though my ears stayed sharp. My mother's voice rose above the others, smooth as glass. She spoke of her legacy, of how Rachel would someday take over her place on the board, how the Bennett family's name had become synonymous with generosity. A bitter taste filled my mouth. I thought of David Ross's words, the trust my grandfather left me, and the paperwork my parents had tried to shove under my nose. It wasn't just about inheritance. It was about control, appearances, the story they wanted the community to believe. Jessica appeared at my elbow, her eyes darting nervously. Clara, can we talk? She sounded small, almost guilty. I gave her a flat look, unwilling to grant her the comfort she was fishing for. You already did enough talking, I said quietly. To Rachel, to my parents. Her face paled, and she started to protest, but Rachel's laughter rang out across the room, cutting her off. Jessica glanced that way, then back at me, her silence betraying her choice. She moved away, disappearing into the circle forming around Rachel and Bradley. The betrayal stung, but I tucked it down, keeping my face calm. If Linda was right, if there really were numbers that did not add up, then my mother's empire of charity was not as solid as she wanted everyone to think. Later, while dessert plates clattered back to the kitchen, I slipped away into the hallway. The family office door was slightly ajar, the glow of a desk lamp spilling into the dark corridor. My father's voice carried softly through the crack, measured and tense. Margaret, you need to be careful. If someone starts digging into those transfers, the board will come down hard. I froze. Transfers. The word alone was enough. Margaret's reply was sharp-clipped. Nobody will find anything. Everything is handled. Clara is too naive to understand, and Rachel will benefit in the long run. That is all that matters. My nails dug into my palm, fury rising with each syllable. So it was true. The charity she flaunted was not built on generosity but on shifting numbers, hidden transactions, lies. I stepped back before the floorboards betrayed me, retreating down the hall until the murmur of their voices faded. My heart raced as I returned to the living room, blending back into the crowd, just as a neighbor asked me about my work in Chicago. I smiled, politely answering in vague terms, though my mind was elsewhere. I thought of my grandfather again, of how proud he had been to contribute to real causes in his community, how careful he had been with every dollar. He would have been horrified to see his daughter twisting generosity into self-promotion and fraud. The room felt warmer, stifling, so I excused myself onto the porch. The cold night air hit my skin like ice, but it cleared my head. Snowflakes swirled under the porch light, settling on the wreath hanging crookedly on the door. Inside, the voices rose again, a symphony of wealth, pride, and deception. I pulled out my phone, scrolling to David Ross's number, then hesitated. Not yet. I needed more than suspicions, more than overheard words. If I moved too soon, she would bury everything deeper. What I needed was proof. I tucked the phone back in my purse and stared at the snow-covered lawn stretching out toward the street. My breath clouded in the air, steadying me. I had been blindsided at that table with trust papers, humiliated in front of strangers, and abandoned by the friend I thought I could rely on. But this was different. This was leverage, and leverage was power. The door opened behind me, and Rachel stepped out, draping her shawl over her shoulders. She looked radiant under the porch light, her lips curved in that same condescending smile she had worn since childhood. "You really embarrassed Mom tonight, Clara," she said softly, as though sharing a secret. "She just wants what is best for us." I turned toward her, my voice quiet but cutting. "What is best for her is not the same as what is best for us." Rachel's smile faltered, but only for a second. She tucked her hair behind her ear and went back inside, leaving the cold air to close around me again. I stayed outside until my fingers went numb, breathing in the winter night, holding on to the single truth I had uncovered. My mother's house of cards was not invincible, and one day soon I would be the one to knock it down. The night after Christmas dinner, I sat at my kitchen table in Chicago, the glow of the city skyline flickering through the window, and laid out everything I had gathered. David Ross's warning about the trust. Linda Green's quiet words about missing numbers. My mother's own voice from the hallway, sharp and careless, admitting to transfers. Each piece felt like a card in a hand I had not realized I was holding. I had never been one to pick fights with my family. Most of my life, I swallowed the slights, let the spotlight fall on Rachel, and told myself it was not worth the trouble. But this was different. This was not about bruised feelings. It was about theft, betrayal, and my grandfather's legacy. The box of Christmas decorations still sat half unpacked in the corner of my apartment. I stared at the tangle of lights, the ornaments wrapped in old tissue paper, and thought of all the holidays I had spent at that long dining room table, waiting for approval that never came. This year was the last time I would ever beg for it. I pulled out my phone and typed a message to David. "I need copies of the will and any documents they tried to change." His reply came within minutes, already prepared. "You can pick them up tomorrow morning." I felt the tension in my chest ease slightly. Proof. That was the first step. The second step came unexpectedly. 2 days later, while I was leaving work, a brown envelope slid under the door of my office. No return address. Inside were bank statements, photocopied checks, and transfer records. Margaret Bennett, her signature sprawled across the bottom of each page. Money pulled from the charity accounts rerouted to a private investment fund in Rachel's name. My hands shook as I spread the papers across my desk. Whoever had sent this knew exactly what they were doing. I thought of Linda. Maybe she had more than suspicions. Maybe she had wanted me to see the truth for myself. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and spread both sets of documents on the table. On one side, my grandfather's will with my name, written clearly as an equal heir. On the other, evidence that my mother's public image was built on fraud. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of control. As New Year's Eve approached, invitations and group messages filled my phone, all centered around Rachel and Bradley's engagement party. I declined them all. I had no interest in playing supporting character to her show. Instead, I began planning quietly, piece by piece. I knew my family would expect me to show up at their house again, to argue, to shout, to fight the way they always painted me. But I would not give them that. I would be silent, deliberate, and ready. On the morning of the 30th of December, I met David in his downtown office. He slid a folder across the polished table, his eyes steady. "Everything you asked for." He tapped the cover once. "And Clara, remember, this is not just paper. This is your protection." I nodded, my throat tight with gratitude. He had always treated me as though I mattered, just like my grandfather had. Walking out into the cold wind, I pulled the folder close against my chest. I could already picture the box. I would wrap it in the bow, tied neatly on top, the weight of it waiting under the tree. Not a gift of gold or silver, but one that carried truth sharp enough to cut through every lie. At home that night, I sat on the floor, scissors and tape scattered around me, the documents tucked carefully into a cedar box I had bought years ago at a flea market. It had been meant for keepsakes, but it would serve a far greater purpose now. I lined it with tissue paper, sealed it with ribbon, and stared at the finished package. The hum of the heater filled the quiet apartment as I leaned back against the couch, my heart steady for the first time in days. The plan was simple. I would place the box beneath the Christmas tree when the time was right, leave the house without looking back, and let them discover the truth for themselves. No yelling, no tears, no chance to twist my words. Just silence, cold and final. For years, I had believed I was powerless against them. But as I looked at that box, small and ordinary on the surface, I understood that sometimes the strongest weapon was not fury or pleading. It was proof. It was timing. It was the courage to walk away and let the truth speak in your absence. I set the box gently on the counter, turned off the lights, and let the city glow through my windows as I whispered to myself that I was ready. Snow was still falling the next evening when I pulled my coat tight and slipped the wrapped cedar box into a tote bag. The city felt hushed under the weight of winter, the streets slick with fresh ice, the air sharp against my skin. My apartment had been a cocoon all day, quiet and warm, but as I stepped outside, I knew there was no turning back. The drive north to Evanston felt longer than usual. Streetlights blurred against the windshield, and every song on the radio sounded tinny far away. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel each time I thought of my mother's smirk, of Rachel's laugh, echoing across the dining room, of Jessica's silence when she could have spoken. I replayed the words I had overheard in the hallway about the transfers, the warnings from David Ross, the betrayal that had left me raw. They were fuel now, steadying me with each mile. By the time I pulled up outside the Bennett house, the driveway was full. Guests had already arrived, their cars lining the curb, headlights flashing as latecomers pulled in. The house itself glittered with lights on every window, a wreath bigger than me hanging across the front door. Through the picture window, I could see the Christmas tree, glowing ornaments sparkling in reds and golds. Voices carried even through the glass, laughter, rising like a performance staged for the neighborhood. I parked 2 houses down, slipped the strap of the tote across my shoulder, and walked carefully along the icy sidewalk. Each step echoed with the memory of the plan I had whispered to myself the night before. Simple, deliberate, final. The front door opened before I could knock. My father stood there, his expression polite but distant, the same mask he had worn my entire life. "Clara," he said flatly, as if my name were an obligation. Then he stepped aside to let me in. Warmth and noise enveloped me instantly. The living room was packed, neighbors and colleagues, balancing glasses of champagne, their eyes bright as they hung on every word Rachel spoke. She stood near the fireplace, radiant in a deep green gown, Bradley beside her, in a perfectly tailored suit. They looked like a photograph from a glossy magazine, the golden couple surrounded by admirers. My mother floated among the guests. Her dress a bold crimson, her diamond earrings catching the light with each practiced turn of her head. She carried herself like a queen at court, her voice pitched to carry over the hum of conversation. The room bent around her just as it always had. I slipped off my coat, hung it quietly on the rack, and pressed the tote bag closer to my side. No one paid much attention. They were too focused on Rachel, who was laughing at something Bradley whispered. Jessica stood close, her hand lightly on Rachel's arm, nodding with every word as if she had always belonged in her circle. I moved toward the far edge of the room unnoticed, and let the tote rest against my legs. For a moment I simply watched. The guests clinked glasses, exchanged holiday wishes, praised Rachel's latest court case. My mother swept into the circle near the fireplace and announced proudly that Rachel would soon be taking over her position on the Women's League board. Applause erupted and my sister's cheeks flushed with pleasure. I sipped water from a glass a passing server offered me and let the noise wash over me. They thought they had won. They believed they had cut me out, silenced me, erased me from the family story. But the box at my feet told another truth, and the weight of it steadied me. After an hour of chatter and speeches, the crowd shifted toward the tree for the final toast. My mother lifted her glass, her smile dazzling. "We are so proud of Rachel and Bradley," she declared. "They are the future of this family, the legacy we dreamed of." Guests clapped, shouted, congratulations, raised their glasses high. Rachel leaned into Bradley's shoulder, her diamond sparkling like a star. I set my glass down on the mantel, smoothed the front of my dress, and stepped forward. The room grew quieter as I crossed toward the tree. My mother's smile wavered for a fraction of a second, then returned brighter and sharper. "Clara," she said, her tone sweet but warning, "you have been so quiet tonight. Would you like to share a few words for your sister?" My hands did not shake as I reached into the tote and pulled out the cedar box wrapped neatly with ribbon. I placed it gently beneath the tree, its polished surface gleaming in the light. "Just a small gift for the family," I said evenly, my voice steady in the sudden hush. Gasps rippled across the room. Rachel tilted her head, lips curving in a smirk. "How thoughtful," she said, drawing a laugh from Bradley. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion flickering beneath her mask. I folded my hands and stepped back, letting silence hang heavy. The guests whispered among themselves, curiosity pulling their gazes to the box. Jessica's eyes darted between me and Rachel, her lips pressed tight, but she said nothing. Margaret glided forward, her smile taut. She bent down, lifted the box with deliberate grace, and carried it to the coffee table. "Shall we see what Clara has brought us?" she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Rachel leaned over her shoulder, Bradley watching with amusement. The paper crinkled under my mother's fingers as she untied the ribbon. The cedar lid creaked softly as she lifted it open. For a moment the room was frozen, all eyes fixed on her face as she looked inside. Her expression shifted in an instant. The confident smile dissolved her lips, tightening, her eyes widening before narrowing in fury. The documents lay exposed in the box, neatly stacked, undeniable in their detail. The will naming me an equal heir. The bank transfers, signatures, and numbers that told a story none of her speeches could erase. The room held its breath. Rachel blinked, her smirk faltering. Bradley frowned, leaning closer to read. Jessica took a small step back, her face pale. Guests craned their necks, confused whispers rising like smoke. I stood still, my heart calm, my hands folded in front of me. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the carols still playing from the speakers. The tree lights twinkled innocent against the weight of what had just been revealed. For the first time in my life, I did not need to raise my voice or explain myself. The truth was already speaking louder than I ever could. Gasps spread like a ripple across the room, voices rising in startled whispers. My mother slammed the lid, shut, her hands trembling despite the effort to hide it. Her cheeks flushed deep red, and for the first time I could remember her perfect mask cracked. Rachel leaned over, snatching a page from the stack before Margaret could tuck it back inside. Her eyes darted across the words, the smirk sliding right off her face. "What is this?" she snapped, her voice sharp and panicked. Bradley tried to grab the paper from her hand, but she pulled away, glaring at my mother. "Is this true?" The guests stirred uneasily, murmuring louder, some craning their necks to catch a glimpse. My father shifted near the fireplace, his face pale, his mouth opening, as if to speak, then closing again. He looked smaller in that moment, like a man realizing too late the walls around him were collapsing. Margaret recovered quickly, or tried to. "These are lies," she announced, her voice louder than necessary. "Someone has fabricated this to make us look bad. Clara, how dare you bring this into our home on Christmas?" Her words snapped the crowd back into silence. Dozens of eyes swung to me, curious, skeptical, waiting. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves, and Margaret knew it. Rachel flipped another page, her jaw tightening. Transfers from the Women's League Fund, she read aloud, her voice rising with each word. "Into an account with my name on it." She spun toward my mother, her face white with fury. "Did you do this? Did you put money in my name?" Bradley's face hardened, his hand tightening on her arm. Margaret reached for the papers, but Rachel jerked them away. "I can't believe you," Rachel hissed. "Do you realize what this means for me, for my career, for everything I've built?" The crowd erupted into overlapping voices. Some guests excused themselves, quietly slipping out the front door with murmured goodbyes. Others stayed, faces lit with the kind of morbid fascination people only feel when a scandal unfolds in front of them. Jessica hovered near the couch, her eyes wide and lips pressed thin. When I looked at her, she dropped her gaze, cheeks burning, shame finally cutting through her silence. Margaret clapped her hands, demanding order, but her voice no longer carried the same power. She turned on me, her words venomous. "You have ruined this family, Clara. Do you understand what you've done?" My voice was calm when I answered, "No, Mother, I have only revealed what you've done." Her face twisted with rage, but before she could reply, Linda Green stepped forward from the back of the room. She had slipped in quietly earlier, unnoticed by most, but now all eyes turned to her. "I've suspected for months," she said firmly. "Missing funds, irregular reports, donations that never reached their intended programs. And here is the proof." The weight of Linda's words crushed the last of my mother's composure. She sank into a chair, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for escape. My father remained frozen near the mantel, his shoulders slumped, his silence damning. Rachel dropped the papers onto the coffee table, her fury directed at both of them now. "You've dragged me into this," she spat. "You made me part of your lies." She turned on Bradley, but his expression was unreadable. His hand slipped from hers, and he stepped back, leaving her to stand alone in the glow of the Christmas tree. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with judgment. The guests who remained looked anywhere but at my mother, embarrassed to witness her downfall. The carols still played faintly from the speakers, jarringly cheerful against the chaos. I stood quietly, watching, my heart steady. I had not raised my voice, had not begged, had not pleaded. I had only shown them the truth, and it was enough to unravel everything. Margaret finally spoke again, her tone desperate. "Clara, you don't understand the sacrifices I've made for this family. Everything I've done has been to protect our name, our future." I met her eyes without flinching. "No, everything you've done has been to protect yourself." The words hung in the air, simple and final. She flinched as though I had struck her, but I didn't move. Rachel stormed toward the hallway, her heels pounding against the floor, the papers clutched tight in her hand. Bradley followed at a distance, his expression dark. Guests whispered, some slipping out quietly, others waiting as though reluctant to miss the next act of the drama. Margaret remained seated, her hand trembling on the armrest, her gaze unfocused. My father looked at me then, his eyes tired, his mouth opening as though to apologize, but no words came. I drew in a slow breath, feeling the warmth of the room press against me, the tree lights flickering against the cedar box still resting open on the table. For the first time in years, I felt taller, steadier, as though my grandfather's voice was whispering in my ear again. "Stand strong when no one else stands with you." I gathered my coat from the rack, slipped it over my shoulders, and turned toward the door. No one stopped me. The room was too heavy with shame, too tangled in the wreckage of what had just been revealed. The night air outside was cold and bracing. Snow crunched under my boots as I walked back to my car, the glow of the Bennett house fading behind me. I had left the truth in their hands. What they did with it was no longer my concern. The drive back into Chicago felt longer than usual, the highway dark and quiet, the glow of the city on the horizon pulling me forward like a beacon. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than they needed to, but I welcomed the tension. It kept me grounded after what had unfolded in that house. When I reached my apartment, the stillness inside felt like a reprieve. I set my keys on the counter, slipped off my coat, and stood by the window staring down at the streetlights reflecting off patches of snow. My phone buzzed on the table screen, lighting up with call after call, all from numbers I knew too well. I let them go unanswered. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. Emails had already started coming in. One was from Linda Green. She kept it brief. "Clara, I'm so sorry for how it all came out tonight. But you did the right thing. I'll be in touch tomorrow with next steps." Next steps. The word steadied me. This wasn't just about family anymore. The documents I had dropped into that cedar box weren't only proof of theft. They were leverage, and Linda knew exactly how to use them. By morning, the city was buzzing. Local news had picked up the story. Anonymous sources spoke of missing charitable funds discrepancies in reports and whispers of criminal investigation. Margaret Bennett's name was everywhere, her pristine reputation unraveling with every headline. At work, my colleagues greeted me with cautious glances, some offering supportive smiles, others too polite to ask outright what they had read. My manager, Mr. Lowell, called me into his office. "Clara, I don't know what's going on," he said gently, "but take as much time as you need. Family things like this, they're messy." I thanked him, relieved for the space. The truth was, I had already decided to step back for a while. Marketing campaigns and project deadlines felt insignificant compared to the storm my family had created. Later that afternoon, Jessica showed up at my building. I saw her through the glass door before she buzzed up. She looked different, her usual confidence replaced with hesitation. Against my better judgment, I let her in. She stood in my living room, shifting from foot to foot. "Clara, please," she began. "I had no idea what Margaret was doing. I never meant to betray you." I crossed my arms. "You sat there, Jess. You laughed when Rachel mocked me. You let them push me out as if I didn't matter." Tears welled in her eyes, her voice breaking. "I know, and it was wrong. I wanted so badly to belong somewhere that I ignored what it was costing you. I can't take it back, but I want to make it right." I didn't answer immediately. Part of me longed to believe her, to lean on someone familiar in the wreckage. But another part remembered every time she had chosen Rachel's approval over my friendship. Finally, I said quietly, "Making it right isn't about me anymore. It's about what you do from here." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "If you'll let me, I'll testify. I'll tell Linda everything I know." That was the first time her words carried weight. For once, Jessica wasn't thinking of herself. The following days blurred together. Investigators moved quickly, interviewing board members, combing through financial records, questioning employees of the Women's League. Margaret's name was no longer whispered, but shouted, splashed across every headline in Chicago. My father tried to keep a low profile, but silence can be its own confession. Rachel called me one evening. Her voice was sharp, brittle, like glass about to shatter. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me? Bradley's parents won't even return my calls. He hasn't spoken to me since Christmas. My career is in ruins because of you." I held the phone away from my ear, her words tumbling fast, frantic. When she paused to breathe, I answered softly, "No, Rachel. Your career is in ruins because you chose to let them use you." She cursed, screamed something I couldn't quite catch, and hung up. I stared at the phone, feeling only a quiet sadness. Meanwhile, my grandfather's trust, the one Margaret had tried so hard to rewrite, was finally examined. Linda's legal team confirmed what I had long suspected. The trust had been altered illegally, signatures, forged documents manipulated. My rightful share had been siphoned into accounts linked to my parents and by extension Rachel. When I read the findings, my hands shook. It wasn't about money, not entirely. It was about truth, about validation after years of being dismissed, belittled, erased. For once the record showed I wasn't imagining it. On a cold Friday morning, I walked into the courthouse with Linda at my side. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing as we entered. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and polished wood, the hum of legal voices bouncing off the walls. Margaret sat at the defense table, immaculate as ever in a navy suit, her pearl necklace gleaming under the lights. She didn't look at me, but I felt her presence like a shadow pressing against my back. My father sat beside her, his face blank, his hands folded tightly in front of him. The hearing was procedural, just the beginning. But even beginnings carry weight. The judge acknowledged the documents allowed evidence to move forward and set the next date. It was enough. When it ended, I stepped outside into the winter air. Reporters crowded and microphones thrust toward me. I shook my head, saying nothing. The truth didn't need my commentary. It was already louder than any words I could speak. That night, back in my apartment, I curled up on the couch with a blanket, the city lights glowing outside my window. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to exhale. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. As I closed my eyes, I thought of my grandfather. I imagined him sitting at that same table where Margaret had once dictated every word, telling me softly that I had done what he always hoped someone in this family would do. I wasn't the weak daughter anymore. I wasn't the afterthought. I was the one who refused to stay silent. The morning after the hearing, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing against the nightstand. Dozens of notifications lit up the screen. News alerts, emails, missed calls. I sat up slowly, the gray light of dawn slipping through my blinds, and scrolled through headlines. My mother's name dominated every one of them. Margaret Bennett accused of embezzlement. Charitable funds diverted to personal accounts. Legal storm brews around Bennett Family Trust. Each article carried a photo of her, the once flawless image now framed by words like fraud and betrayal. For years, she had controlled the narrative, but now the city was writing its own story. I slipped into jeans and a sweater, made a pot of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, letting the warmth of the mug steady me. A message from Linda blinked on the screen. Good work yesterday. Press is doing half the job for us now. Be ready for discovery requests next week. Discovery, evidence, depositions. Words that used to intimidate me now felt like armor. Later that morning, Jessica knocked on my door. Her face was pale, eyes swollen as if she had not slept. I let her in, wary but curious. She sank into the chair across from me, clasping her hands so tightly her knuckles whitened. Clara, I went to see Rachel yesterday, she said softly. She is falling apart. Bradley has cut her off completely. His family wants nothing to do with her, and your parents are blaming her for everything. I felt a sharp pang of something between pity and anger. She was never innocent, Jess. She stood by them, mocked me, mocked Michael. I know. Jessica's voice broke. But it is worse than I thought. Rachel admitted she knew about the trust changes. She signed some of the paperwork herself. She thought it was harmless, that your parents just wanted to make things simpler. The words chilled me. Simpler meant erasing me with her own pen. Jessica reached across the table. I want to testify, Clara. I can back up what you said about the Christmas dinner, about how they treated you. I can tell the investigators what Rachel admitted. I studied her face, searching for signs of performance, but what I saw was desperation, maybe even shame. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to impress anyone. All right, I said finally. But this isn't about saving Rachel or repairing what we had. This is about telling the truth. She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. I understand. The following days moved quickly. Investigators called me in for interviews, asking about financial records, family dynamics, moments I thought would never matter but suddenly did. I handed over emails, text messages, even the small notebook I had kept when Michael was sick, documenting every call I made to my parents that went unanswered. Each page painted the picture I had lived a family that had chosen appearances over love, money, over loyalty, control, over compassion. One evening, while reviewing documents with Linda at her office, she leaned back in her chair and gave me a rare smile. Clara, this case is strong, stronger than most I have seen. If the judge rules in our favor, not only will you reclaim your inheritance, but your mother could face criminal charges. The thought of her behind bars sent a shiver through me. Not satisfaction, not yet, but the sense that justice was finally within reach. That night, my phone buzzed again, this time with an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was my father. His voice was strained, tired in a way I had never heard before. Clara, please, can we meet? Just the two of us. I hesitated, every instinct screaming not to trust him. But some part of me wanted to see if there was anything left between us worth saving. We agreed to meet at a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city. When I walked in, he was already there, hunched over a cup of coffee. He looked smaller, older, as if the weight of everything had finally settled on his shoulders. I sat down across from him, waiting. He sighed. Your mother... She never thought it would go this far. She thought she could control it like everything else. But it is spiraling. I took a sip of water, saying nothing. He leaned closer. If you drop this, Clara, if you let it go, we can fix things. We can put your name back in the trust, make it right between us. Anger flared hot in my chest. After everything, he still thought this was about money. I set my glass down carefully. This isn't about being back in your trust. It is about the truth. About what you both did, not just to me, but to every person who trusted you. His face hardened, the softness vanishing. You will regret this, he said quietly. Families don't survive wars like this. I stood, dropping a few dollars on the table for my water. Maybe ours isn't meant to survive. I walked out without looking back. That night, as snow began to fall outside my apartment, I stood by the window watching the flakes drift down the city, hushed beneath the white blanket. I thought of Michael, of the nights I had spent at his side in the hospital, wishing for someone to stand with me. He had been right. Some people reveal who they are only when the storm hits. The storm had come, and my family had shown me everything I needed to see. The next week would bring more hearings, more revelations, more cracks in the facade my mother had spent her life building. And I knew I would be there for every one of them. This time I would not flinch. The courthouse was packed on the day of the final ruling, the kind of cold January morning, when the air seemed sharper, cleaner, as if it knew a chapter of my life was about to close. I walked through the heavy double doors with Linda by my side, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her briefcase filled with the evidence we had fought so hard to bring forward. Inside the courtroom, I saw them already seated. My mother in a tailored gray suit, pearls gleaming at her throat, face carefully composed but tight around the eyes. My father sat beside her shoulders, heavy hands folded on the table. Rachel sat behind them, her expression a mix of defiance and exhaustion, as though she still could not decide whether to be furious at me or beg for forgiveness. The judge entered, and the room hushed instantly. My pulse thudded in my ears, but I kept my chin high, my breathing steady. Linda presented the case with quiet confidence, walking the court through forged signatures, diverted funds, and years of records that painted a clear, damning picture. Jessica took the stand too, voice trembling at first, but growing stronger as she confirmed what she had overheard, what Rachel had admitted. For once, Jessica did not hide behind charm or excuses. She told the truth. When it was my mother's turn, she spoke with icy precision, claiming misunderstandings, clerical errors, misplaced trust in accountants. She had always been a master of performance, but the weight of evidence was heavier than her practiced composure. The judge listened, expression unreadable, then delivered the ruling. The trust would be restored to its original intent, my portion reinstated in full. Further investigation into Margaret Bennett's handling of charitable funds would be referred to the state attorney's office. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the room. For a long moment, no one moved. My mother sat frozen, jaw tight, eyes blazing. My father rubbed his temples, avoiding my gaze. Rachel buried her face in her hands. I simply exhaled, the breath shaking out of me as though I had been holding it for years. Outside, the courthouse cameras waited, reporters shouting questions as I stepped into the bright winter light. I said nothing. I did not need to. Justice had spoken for me. Back at my apartment that evening, I opened the cedar box once more. The same box I had left under the Christmas tree weeks earlier. The same box that had carried the truth into my mother's perfectly decorated living room. I traced my fingers over the wood and felt a strange peace. This box had been the end of one life and the beginning of another. A few weeks later, I stood at Lake Michigan, the waves cold and steady against the shore. I carried a small envelope of wildflower seeds, something I had picked up on impulse. As the wind bit at my cheeks, I scattered the seeds across the snow-dusted earth near the water's edge. Growth would come in time, not now, not tomorrow, but eventually. It felt like a fitting symbol for where I stood. Michael's memory was with me, steady and warm. I thought of what he would have said if he were here, his hand in mine, his voice, gentle but sure. You did it, Clara. You stood up. You chose yourself. Life did not turn into a fairy tale. There were still quiet nights when grief pressed in, when the silence of my apartment felt too big, too empty. But there were also mornings filled with light laughter, with new friends' support from people who had chosen me without conditions. My in-laws called often, their voices reminders that family could be chosen, that love did not have to be earned by suffering. I returned to work, gradually poured energy into projects that mattered, even started speaking at community events about resilience, inheritance disputes, and the importance of setting boundaries with toxic families. Each time I spoke, women in their 50s, 60s, 70s came up afterward, pressing my hands, tears in their eyes, telling me they understood, that they too had lived years of favoritism, betrayal, being overlooked, and that my story gave them courage. One evening, Jessica called. Not to ask forgiveness, not to dredge up the past, but simply to say she was proud of me. We were not what we once were, but perhaps we had found a new kind of honesty. Rachel never reached out. My parents sent a few letters, carefully worded attempts to re-establish contact, blaming stress, misunderstanding, illness. I left them unanswered. Some doors once closed should remain that way. On the second spring after Michael's passing, the seeds I had scattered by the lake sprouted into blooms, a wild splash of color against the rocky shore. I visited often, sitting quietly, watching them sway in the breeze. Life had grown again, stubborn and beautiful even after the harshest winter. As I sat there one afternoon, the sun warming my face, I realized I no longer carried the same heaviness in my chest. The anger had eased, the grief had softened, and in its place was something steadier. Strength, peace, freedom. If you are listening to this and you have been cut down by family, dismissed, betrayed, or written out of a story that should have included you, I hope you hear this clearly. You are not defined by the people who failed you. You are defined by how you choose to stand again. Tell me, have you ever had to walk away from family to protect yourself? Did you ever find strength in starting over? Share your story in the comments, because your words might be the very thing someone else needs tonight. And if my journey resonated with you, stay with me here. There are more stories of resilience, of justice, of healing after betrayal. You are not alone, and together we can keep building the kind of family we truly deserve.